Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with George Haraksin. You are a professor of philosophy and also ethics, and you are going to be joining us to talk about a big question, and that's why would God allow evil and suffering? That's such a huge question. We have a limited amount of time, so we'll do our best to respond to it. But before we dive in to why, let's first define our terms. So when we talk about evil, what are people generally talking about when they say evil?
I just want to make a comment about the time frame. I used to tell my students, if you're going to ask the hard question, you have to sit around for the long answer.
All right, well, we'll wait.
Right now. What are they talking about? That's actually kind of a really good question, is to ask people, when you refer to evil, what are you talking about? So philosophers talk about the ontology of evil, or what is evil a thing? Is it like a gooey substance that you can just get rid of? Right. Or is it something more like what St. Augustine said? It's a privation of goodness. It's a lack of goodness. So it's real, but you can't just zap it away. You have to restore goodness, right? Just like if there's a shadow, well, that's a lack of light. And so if you have light all around, like in a photography studio, then there wouldn't be that shadow, or it would be minimized. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's a lack of goodness. So then we have some sort of understanding of goodness. I've always heard it kind of couched as, we talk about like natural evil and moral evil. So when we engage in conversations, and I think particularly of a lot of people I know and love who are in the midst of, or maybe past their season of deconstructing their faith, rebuilding it or not. But this is a big question that people in that space have, and I think we need to be equipped on how to address the moral evil and then the natural evil, because those are two very different things.
Right, so natural evil is going to be the resulting suffering, pain, and that happens due to a natural event, let's say a hurricane. We're not saying that the hurricane or the earthquake itself is evil, like you bad earthquake. Right. No, we're saying that the result of it, the resulting suffering and pain caused or destruction, whereas moral evil is a result of the human will, right? It's a result of human actions in that case. And so I think you actually have to approach those questions a little bit differently, and so you develop different kinds of answers to those, right? And I always talk about you can put on different hats, like if someone's asking an intellectual question, I want to put on my philosopher, theologian hat. But if it's coming from a place of pain, they're struggling with the weight and the burden of evil in their own life or someone they know, then you want to put on your friend, your counselor hat, the pastor hat. I was a pastor for a long time. So if you just take the intellectual side, it could seem cold and heartless.
Right, and I think that's a great balance, because sometimes you don't have necessarily the heart question. It is an intellectual question. And so those platitudes, they don't really work in general, but they won't work especially in an intellectual conversation.
Right, as we have talked about before, the emotional person wants a hug. They want you to be there with them, to share the burden or to help lift it. But the intellectual wants a logical hug.
Right.
They want to be
a logical hug.
They want some real answers to it. They may not be struggling with the burden right now, but they're struggling with the rational compatibility of an all good, all powerful God and the reality of evil.
Right. And so let's dive into that. Like, let's give people a logical hug. What would you say if they're saying, hey, like, if God exists, and we don't know which one, but if God exists, why would God allow his children, her children, however they're going to phrase it, to suffer? If this is a loving God, why would that God allow children and other people to suffer?
Well, notice that you pointed to the fact that there are different understandings of God, other religions than that. So usually this is couched, at least historically or traditionally, with an all-good, all-powerful God and the reality of evil and suffering. So if you remove or change some of that, the problem changes, right? Because you could have an all-loving God, but if he's not powerful enough, well, then you can understand why there's evil and suffering. Same thing in the other case. If God is all powerful but not all loving, well, that explains why there's
Right.
evil.
There you go.
So it's the compatibility there. Can an all good, all powerful, all knowing God and evil coexist? And I think there's kind of two different issues here. Like we already said, there's the logical or intellectual problem, and then there's the emotional problem. And we want to deal with those in a little bit different ways. But on the intellectual side, we can talk about the logical compatibility of those two ideas, God and evil, or just the amount of gratuitous evil and suffering. Because
Right.
I think most people recognize that we can understand, especially moral evils, why bad things happen, because that bad person did X or Y. It's those gratuitous examples of evil, mass shootings, a tsunami wipes out hundreds of people or something. So we have to approach those in different ways.
Right. What about Jesus then? Can we say with regard to suffering and his experience with suffering?
Yeah, I think it was the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga who made this point, is that Jesus sort of shows us that God does not sit idly by in the midst of our suffering and in the midst of evil. He is a very clear pointer that God cares and is willing to do something about the evil and suffering in the world. So it's a clear pointer that God exists and he's doing something about it. I think we should be very clear to say that God hates evil. He is working against suffering or at least gratuitous suffering and those who promote such things. He's developing a group of people to fight against that.
So if we have anyone who's listening or watching right now and they're in the midst of just grappling with this question, and they're in a space where they're open to opening up their Bible or searching online, what would you point them to just as a sense of comfort, knowing that this isn't the end of the conversation, but just something to offer some sort of hug, as you called it?
Yeah, it's interesting that Jesus and the Bible offers both intellectual and I think emotional support for this. I remember 2 Corinthians 1 talks about we serve the God of all comfort who comforts us in all of our in the trials that we go through. And there's clear pointers back again to Jesus, that God showed us through Jesus that he is attempting to overcome all of this in the world, all this evil. And I think let me give you an example. As a young pastor, I got a call from a family member, and found out that one of my cousins committed suicide. Very trying time. I went over with my dad to their house, and immediately they knew what I did for a living and stuff like that. They greeted me at the door, but they immediately started asking questions. Where is he? Is he going to this place or that place?
Right.
But then you could see the burden on their faces. And one of them actually took me to a room and sat me down and looked at me and said, where is he? Yeah. And of course, I can't answer that question. Again, I can't give you the reason why he did, this particular thing, but I did say, if it's true that, as the New Testament says, God is all good and all powerful, he will do the right thing with your brother. He will do the right thing in this situation. Even though I can't explain why he, committed suicide.
So you've given a lot of really great information, and at the end of the day, we hope that people will take what they've seen and step into a conversation or be equipped to have a conversation. So let's say someone comes to them and they're really struggling either from the intellectual perspective or a heart pain point perspective of why God would allow evil and suffering. How do they have that conversation?
Yeah. I think having those categories in your mind is helpful. Are they struggling more with the intellectual, rational side or more with the emotional side? Of course, as human beings, it's always intertwined, so I don't mean to be simplistic about it. But if it's on the emotional side, they're carrying a weight, a burden. We have to meet their emotional intensity. The person you're interacting with may be crying. It doesn't mean you give false tears, but it's our facial expressions, our body language, the tone of our voice has to meet that emotional intensity. They have to have a sense that they've been heard in their pain. And then that actually comes to help to lift some of that burden, especially helping them talk out. So someone once said, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we would listen a lot more. And I think having that listening posture is so important, because we might want to answer the question, or if they're doubting God, we want to give an answer, but it's good to lay that lie and make that emotional connection first. Not as a trick, but authentically engaging a human being who's in pain.
Right. I love that you phrased it that way, because sometimes people think of the end goal. I need to get them to say the sinner's prayer afterwards. And it's like, hey, that might be like 30 conversations from now, or maybe not what's going to happen, but just be there for them as a friend.
I think, at least in my experience, also being a pastor, getting that emotional connection, them knowing that you care, opens up pathways or bridges to many other intellectual conversations, because those questions are going to arise. And I know that in one case, I went over weeks afterwards visiting people and talking through these hard issues, because they have more energy to actually deal with the intellectual questions when the burden has lifted a little bit.
Thank you so much for that. If you'd like to hear more from George Haraksin, go to reasons.org and search for George Haraksin.